ask some of you, how many here have seen Windows 8 before? Not just on television or in advertisements, but actually seen it. Any hands? Very good. How many people here have used it? Okay, so some. And many of them are Microsoft people. Well, we hope we will convince many more people to use this new operating system over the next number of months. I think it's also important to realize that this is a media forum. And for some people, they say, hold on a second, why is Windows being spoken about in a media forum? And Carlos gave you an impression a moment ago about the possibilities. And I think it's very important for you to realize that for the first time ever, Windows is now also a media platform. And I think this is an important opportunity for marketers and agencies and consumers, in fact, to see some of the commercial and brand experiences that will be possible. And I'm going to show you some of those. But first, let me introduce you a little bit to Windows 8. And I wanted to give you a little bit of history, if you will. It's funny, isn't it, that the QWERTY keyboard, and it's not possible to see it very well here because of the light, but the QWERTY keyboard, and I think it's called QWERTY Enya in Spain, was invented, I think, about 140 years ago. And essentially, it was because of the mechanics that were required in that age. The keys of a keyboard had to be organized in a certain way that they didn't lock with each other. And so 140 years ago, a certain standard was brought to bear because of the mechanical requirements of that time. And isn't it funny then, that even today, we still use a keyboard and a format that was defined in a mechanical era over 100 years ago. Now, we've played with it, of course. We've messed around to try and make it a little bit easier to use in this new era. And we've done some interesting things. This is a Windows 8 alternative keyboard possibility. But still, even now, it is still the QWERTY keyboard, essentially, that we are using, defined by a mechanical era a long time ago. And the same is true of the computing environment that we're in today. The Altair was produced, one of the first personal computers, and people began to engage with that. And of course, for many of us that are a little bit older in the audience, we recognize command lines and the language of machine code and so on. But if computing and personal computing was ever to get more realistic, some new metaphor had to be created. And what happened was, pretty much the mouse was invented in the 1960s, and then in Xerox PARC laboratories in 1974, they combined the mouse with a graphical user interface. And that was a very interesting step forward. And of course, there were a number of important visitors that went to PARC Xerox and were inspired by some of the work there. But essentially, at that time, you saw the emergence of something called the desktop. And the desktop was a way to make computing much more accessible for users. And this is Windows 1, and you see the desktop still prevailing. You have filing cabinets, and folders, and documents, and waste baskets. And our competitors, of course, as well, followed the same paradigm as they went on the journey. This became Windows 3 in this instance, and then we had Windows 95. And yes, Windows 95 was different, but guess what? It still had many of the elements that were defined as the desktop. And then we went to Windows XP, and some extra sound effects that are needed in every presentation. Windows XP, the desktop prevailed, And then we had Windows Vista, and by the way, this slide is blurry because Microsoft likes to forget a little bit about Windows Vista. And so we will move on to Windows 7. Now, Windows 7 has been an incredibly successful operating system for us. Carlos mentioned 600 plus million copies have sold in just 3 years. But again, the desktop paradigm is remaining in effect. And of course, the desktop metaphor continues with our competitors' products and so on. And that brings me to the mobile era. Some of us in the audience actually had text and pager equipment. I showed this to my team the other day and they said to me, "What the hell is that thing?" So obviously I'm glad we have youthful people around us. And then we had the brick phone. And then finally you started to have the emergence of an interface on the mobile device. And as the mobile interface evolved, guess what paradigm, guess what model started to go onto the mobile interface? It was the desktop again. These static icons that were inspired by our workplace. And here was an early Windows phone. And of course the static icons, many of which are work-inspired, were on the other phones that have come forward since. So the desktop still prevails. And in the touch tablet era, this was a Microsoft device from 2002, a touch device, and of course into the static icons of today with the Apple systems and so on. So I suppose my point is, the QWERTY keyboard was something defined by the mechanical era 100 years ago. And the desktop is the design paradigm from 40 years ago that still prevails. So we try to understand in Microsoft, how can we rethink the desktop for a new era? Because so many things have changed. We have social networks. We have connectivity. We have new generations of people. We have multiple devices and we're using those devices in a different way. So we thought, how can we rethink the desktop? And so we started to concept and get some ideas about how that paradigm, that design metaphor could change. And we really made an effort to reimagine the interface and have a very design-led and information and consumer-led approach, not an office paradigm from 40 years ago. And we also tried to imagine the future where surfaces would be completely changed from today and evolved from today. And what we arrived at was this device, because the user interface that we put forward here was really something different. It wasn't like other operating systems that you see on other phones. It was completely unique. Now this phone is the Microsoft Windows phone, and it hasn't sold enormously. It hasn't sold enormously. But the design principles that applied to the creation of this have influenced our whole company. We've really believed in the approach that we're taking here from a design point of view. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from design experts and analysts about this approach. And I wanted to show you this nice little quote. You may have seen it before, perhaps, but it will surprise you, I think, to see who said this. This is and for those of you at the back that can't see, it was Steve Wozniak. So Woz said this about the design interface. And we have had others who have done likewise. So in effect then, this design story that we've come through is bringing me to the next part of my demonstration, which is around Windows. We now have some context. Now you may say, well, that's all very well and good. But I think what's interesting here is that for our phone, we really did not have a lot of market share. This is honest. And so to be daring and to be different with a phone when you have a small market share, that's good. But when you are daring with with an operating system that has over 1 billion installations worldwide.